For centuries, Jews around the world have been lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem and their temple, which they believe was the beginning of their long 2,000 years of exile. Exile is not only a religious Jewish belief. For millions of Jews and of non-Jews alike, it's a historical fact.
So that's one of the most dramatic points that you can really touch the end of Jerusalem. And not only the end of Jerusalem, the end of the existence of ongoing life of Jews in this country.
But what has been considered as fact for centuries has been challenged by archaeological evidence unearthed across Israel. Here, only 70 miles from Jerusalem, in the ancient town of Sepphoris, evidence does not point to a people driven into exile, but on the contrary, to a population that flourished. So why has exile been perceived as a tangible reality for thousands of years? And if it never existed, what accounts for the millions of Jews who over centuries have settled around the world? And perhaps the inevitable question, what happened to inhabitants of places like Sepphoris who were never exiled? Until 1948, a predominantly Muslim Palestinian village stood on the ruins of Sepphoris. The village was destroyed, and its inhabitants barred from returning. Is it possible that some of the Palestinian refugees are descendants of ancient Jews who were never exiled? Every day, thousands of Jewish and Christian tourists flock to Jerusalem to experience the story of exile and confirm the version of history they grew up on. The Jewish rebellion against Rome in 66 AD, which led to the destruction of the temple and the city, the center of ancient Judaism.
We're just reaching now one of the focal places for any Jew worldwide at the time when the temple was still existing up on top of the mountain here. The largest man-made complex on earth that could accommodate 250,000 people. And the need to accommodate so many is because 3 times a year, Jews would gather here in the high holidays at the most sacred place, the meeting place, the place to say, I am a Jew.
Explain
No,
to me.
I
Why
don't.
do you have to be a Jew here?
I don't have to be a Jew here, but the Judaism, my Judaism in Los Angeles is not the same as the Judaism here.
I think that this place, this country, is very much a center and will never lose, nor has it ever lost, that centrality.
The story of exile begins here in the visitor center, where the Jewish temple is virtually made whole again. The temple used to hold Judaism's most sacred objects, symbols of the nation's covenant with God, the Ark of the Covenant, and the candle holder with its 7 branches, the menorah. But what tourists are not being told is that the temple was not only a religious center, but an economic powerhouse, with donations from 4 corners of the empire and the income from hundreds of thousands of pilgrims.
The city was highly inflated. It was very overblown. It had a huge population of people who derived their livelihood from the temple and the pilgrimage trade. And it was also a city which was founded on Jewish piety. Jewish piety was the currency, was the cultural capital of the city. We have to think of something like the Vatican City when we think about Jerusalem. The Vatican City it's embedded in Rome, but it feels quite different from the city that it's embedded in. It has a distinctive internal culture. And the things that are important in the Vatican City are often not very important immediately beyond its boundaries. And I think that the same thing could be said for Jerusalem in the first century.
We are looking at now the nuclear, the beginning of the Jewish people. Think about all those people that for 2,000 years were dreaming about coming to Jerusalem.
In a city run by religious authorities, theological rivalries played an enormous role in shaping the city's politics. Similar to the Vatican, Jerusalem was ruled by its religious authority, the temple priests.
Under the houses of the Jewish quarter of Jerusalem, there are remains of a whole neighborhood, a quarter of the priestly class of Jerusalem from the time of the temple. Here, those priests that served at the temple used to live. And when you look around, you can see that those houses kept quite high standard of living, with mosaic floors and with murals, fresca on the walls, beautiful furniture. And here we have the people that support to be the spiritual leader living in beautiful houses, a good life, while there was so much of poverty around.
Jerusalem and the tiny region of Judea were only a small part of a far larger territory created by series of previous Jewish military expansions, forcing the conquered population to convert to Judaism. Jerusalem, despite the common belief, did not represent the entire Jewish nation.
So the Jewish world has expanded tremendously. There were more of them. They were also in closer connection with each other.
And they were divided.
And they were divided. There were all these profound divisions. So, there's this complicated business that they're all in some sense part of one group. But by the same token, they're often at each other's throats.
It is so the main road of the city that was here. This city that was then the Pearl of the East.
The profound divisions that gave rise to the rebellion have been simplified over time into a single narrative, that of a Jewish nation that refused to accept the authority of a pagan Roman Caesar.
The religion being very institutional, well built here, was also combined of being a nation of Jews. And so it was a way to say, we are unique, we are independent. You can rule us, but still we are independent. And that would be hard for an empire to tolerate it.
There is one man who single-handedly succeeded in shaping the narrative of the rebellion. His name was Josephus Flavius, a son of Jerusalem's priestly elite. His book, The Jewish War, is the most important historical record of the time that has for centuries shaped the perception of the rebellion as a national uprising.
The family for which I'm derived is not an ignoble one, but has descended all along from the priests. So with us, to be of the sacerdotal dignity is an indication of the splendor of a family.
For Josephus, the rebellion was the uprising of the ethnos of the nation of the Jews against the Romans. Josephus reflects this Jerusalemite perspective. He sees things from that angle. He thinks that the Jerusalemites are in control of the entire country, that the priesthood is in control of the country and that everyone is equally loyal to the priesthood in the temple. And that any time a Jerusalemite shows up anywhere in the countryside, people will automatically fall at his feet.
Josephus began his career as a military commander, sent by the rebel leadership in Jerusalem to bring the Galilee into the fold of the rebellion.
אחת הדרכים שהובילה במאה הראשונה לספירה חיברה בין טבריה של חוף הכנרת לבין ליבו של הגליל. בדרך הזו ודאי גם הגיע יוסף בן מתתיהו כמפקדו של הגליל בשנת 66 לספירה. בחור גדל במשפחה מיוחסת בירושלים, סביר להניח חיים די מפונקים, בטח לא עבד קשה מימיו. נשלח עכשיו אל אזור שהוא רובו הגדול אזור כפרי. יש בו רק שתי ערים, ציפורי וטבריה, והוא צריך ללמוד ולהכיר את המרקם החברתי של הגליל, לראות מי איתו, מי נגדו, מי בעדו, מי מסוכן לו. הוא צריך ללמוד את הפוליטיקה של הגליל.
Josephus failed to recruit the Galilee's biggest cities to the rebellion. Jerusalem's national aspiration suffered its first setback in Sepphoris.
But the inhabitants of this city, having determined to continue their allegiance to the Romans, sent to the Roman governor and desired him to come to them immediately and take possession of their city.
Sepphoris' decision not to join the rebellion triggered the interest of Israeli archaeologist Zev Weiss. His findings shed new light on why Sepphoris and the Galilee chose not to rebel.
ציפורי משקפת את ההמשכיות, את החיים, את השלום. כלומר, זו עיר שבחרה לא לשתף במרד, זו עיר שבחרה לפתוח את שעריה לרומא ולהמשיך להתקיים.
Zev's findings cover a period of hundreds of years. They help us imagine a society which Josephus barely mentioned and never focused on.
יש לנו עדויות כבר במאה הראשונה לספירה, עוד בשלב שציפורי הייתה עיר קטנה יותר, מצומצמת בשטחה. יש לנו עדויות ברורות לכך שיש פה איזושהי חשיפה כבר לתרבות האחרת. יש פה כבר נכונות להתחיל לקלוט דברים שבאים מבחוץ.
Zev's discovery of the existence of a pagan temple dating to the time when Sepphoris became a Jewish theological center was nothing short of sensational. Sepphoris also had a Roman theater around the time of the rebellion. It had bathhouses and mosaic floors depicting human figures, all forbidden and unheard of in the religion practiced in Jerusalem and tiny Judea. Sepphoris and Jerusalem seem to symbolize a deep cultural and political divide, rather than the unity of a national uprising.
אני חושב שזה מוקד הסיפור. הקשרים עם רומא, כלומר, האם לקדם את הקשרים, האם לאמץ את התרבות הזרה במסגרות המותרות כמובן, או להתרחק לגמרי ולהימנע מכל מגע עם התרבות הסובבת, עם התרבות הרומית, ולהתייחד כקבוצה עצמאית, יהודית.
Josephus had come to the Galilee alone, expecting to recruit locals to his troops. Rejected by Sepphoris and forced to camp outside of the city, he helplessly watched his army disband.
The sense that you get is that Josephus is desperate to impose his authority, but it's dawning on him, not very gradually, that he doesn't have any authority to impose. And he's left with small groups of people who follow him largely because he's paid them.
Jerusalem might have mobilized for a national war, yet the majority of the Galilee didn't seem to have any interest in a fight. Josephus found himself holed up with a small group of followers in Jotapata, one of the few towns and villages that did end up fighting the Romans.
אחד הדברים הראשונים שראיתי לנכון לבדוק היה האם באמת הביצורים האלה הם ביצורים שבנה ספר מתתיהו. ולכן עשינו פה מאמץ מאוד גדול, למעשה 50% מהחפירה ביודפת הייתה ניסיון לתארך את החומות. החומה הזאת שאנחנו נשענים עליה כאן היא חומה מימי המרד הגדול. הצלחנו בנקודות אחרות להוכיח את זה ארכיאולוגית, והגילוי הזה והמידע הזה היום הוא מהווה אבן בסיס בהבנה שתיאוריו של יוסף בן מתתיהו בספר שלו, מלחמות היהודים, הוא תיאור אמיתי.
For centuries, Perception has been shaped by Josephus' single powerful narrative of a heroic national uprising. Abandoned by his troops before the war even began, Josephus was forced to watch from behind the town's walls as 50,000 Roman soldiers were setting siege to Jotapata. Vastly outnumbered, he and his band of rebels faced certain death.
מצעד ש50,000 איש עוברים פה, זה לקח כמה שעות טובות. המטרה של המצעד הזה היא גם ברורה, ויוסף כותב עליה. הצבא הרומי רצה להפחיד את אנשי יודפת.
We know that Josephus likes to really write up these episodes of resistance, which is quite interesting. It plays into the rest of his account that this is, this was a heroic rebellion. When push came to shove, the Jewish nation offered heroic resistance to the Romans, as is shown by the siege of Jotapata.
Jotapata fell on July the 13th after 40 days of siege. The Romans went on for 3 years, brutally erasing every rebellious community around the country. Towns and villages that did not rebel were spared, and in the Galilee they were the majority. In Jotapata, Josephus' short military career was over. He escaped the fate of his troops and that of the town by hiding in a cave and finally surrendering to the Romans. But Josephus did not die with the people of Jotapata. His life was spared by General Vespasian. Josephus became the general's personal slave, taking, as Roman custom dictates, Vespasian's last name, Flavius.
Vespasian now embraces Josephus, frees him from chains, makes him part of his entourage, eventually brings him to Rome, settles him in a house, and has Josephus write these accounts of the Jewish rebellion against the Romans.
Suddenly, Josephus' version of the rebellion gained an unexpected ally. Having come to power by force and aspiring to establish his own dynasty, Vespasian was a new emperor in search of legitimacy.
The only key to legitimacy in this sort of environment, if you don't have it through descent, is what's called in Latin the jus gladii, the law of the sword. That is, a substantial military victory can make you a legitimate ruler. What this means is that it was in Vespasian's interest to have this war portrayed exactly as Josephus wanted to portray it. A great all-out war between two mighty nations.
In 69 AD, 3 years after he was captured in Jotapata, Josephus returned, not as a Jewish militant fighting Rome, but as a chronicler embedded in the Roman army, invited to witness the fall of his hometown.
This city was completely destroyed and disappeared. And part of this very dramatic last moments of the city could be traced over here when the Jerusalemites tried to escape and save their life when the Romans slaughtered everybody.
More terrible than the noise were the sights that met the eye. Nowhere could the ground be seen between corpses, and the soldiers climbing over heaps of bodies as they chased the fugitives.
Here we are. And you can see the hole here and many other holes all along. Those holes were done by the Romans themselves, the Roman soldiers, at the very last day of Jerusalem, when people tried to use the underground drainage canal here to escape out without being seen by the Roman. How do we know about that? Josephus Flavius speaks about it. Everybody, one by one, was pulled out and have been killed.
To celebrate his victory over the Jews, Emperor Vespasian and his son Titus held a victory parade, exhibiting what was probably the most cherished loot of the war, the Jewish menorah, a proud symbol of a monotheistic religion he thought was vanquished.
The very center of the Roman Empire, that is the Roman Forum, the Capitoline Hill on one end, the Colosseum on another end, is altered in order to celebrate the Flavian victory over the Jews. And I think that it makes a lot of sense to see Josephus' Jewish War as part of that.
Among the Forum's monuments, there is this Titus Arch of Triumph celebrating the destruction of Jerusalem. Its stone carvings depict Roman soldiers carrying the temple's loot and the sacred menorah.
Josephus's sort of desire, retrospectively, to have the Jews unify as a single group, as a mighty nation, and rise up to fight the Romans, which was essentially a kind of Jewish national aspiration which never happened, resonated perfectly with the Flavian dynasty's need to have experienced a great victory over a great nation.
But what happened after the destruction of Jerusalem? Nowhere in his writings does Josephus mention the forced expulsion of the Jews from Jerusalem or the rest of the Roman province. So why is it that exile has been historically perceived as a fact and the destruction of Jerusalem as the evidence?
אז אכן יוסף בן מתתיהו מתאר בספרו ש90,000, זה המספר שהוא נוקב, אני מעריך שהוא מופרז לחלוטין, מתושבי ירושלים, נמכרו לעבדים בלוב, בצפון אפריקה, חלקם הגיע אפילו לאיטליה, לרומא. אבל זה מספר של אוכלוסייה עירונית שאין מאחוריה הגליה של עם.
So that's one of the most dramatic points that you can really touch the end of Jerusalem. And not only the end of Jerusalem, the end of the existence of ongoing life of Jews in this country. Jerusalem is by far the symbol of this huge dramatic end that created the spreading the people all over, the diaspora, and the beginning of this very long process of longing to come back.
הדימוי ההיסטורי הרווח הוא הדימוי שהיהודים גורשו מארצם. והזיקה היא בין גירוש היהודים לבין חורבן ירושלים. התמונה הזאת היא תמונה שהיא פשוט לא נכונה מבחינה היסטורית. הרומאים לא נקטו במדיניות של הגליה של עמים. זה דימוי מקראי שמבוסס על המסופר, על הגליית הבבליים ועוד לפני כן האשורים, אבל הוא לא היה מדיניות של הרומאים. הרומאים השאירו עמים במקומם וטבעו מהם לסור למרות רומי.
התפיסה הכוללת היא שבעקבות מרד החורבן, חורבן המקדש בירושלים, יש לה הגליה של אנשים, והנה אנחנו מתחילים בגלות ארוכה שמי יודע מתי תגיע לסיומה. ההפך הוא הנכון. אנחנו רואים שברחבי הגליל, ציפורי זה אחד היישובים, יישובים אחרים, האוכלוסייה היהודית לא שארית הפליטה, לא משפחות בודדות, אלא מדברים על יישוב שהולך ומתפתח, הולך וגדל.
Despite the ample evidence gathered in the Galilee, the perception persists that the destruction of Jerusalem put an end to Jewish life here. Masada, the last chapter in Josephus's book, is the place that best illustrates the power of legend over reality. Hundreds of thousands of tourists visit Masada each year. This isolated rock, on which the last battle occurred after the fall of Jerusalem, has become one of Israel's most visited national parks.
This is a very critical turning point in the history of the area. Okay? And this, by the way, is an example of what Josephus was talking about.
According to Josephus, 960 Jewish militants whom he named zealots fled with their families from Judea and Jerusalem to the edge of the desert on the shores of the Dead Sea. They barricaded themselves in this fortress and withstood the Roman siege for 3 years.
L'armée la plus puissante du monde et la plus équipée dans le monde. Et de l'autre côté, 960 zélotes. Des femmes, des enfants, avec des livres de la Torah. C'est ceux-là qui veulent continuer la bataille.
Nyt Mr. Pellinen tekee sateen.
Sperando che dopo una settimana o un mese, 2, finisce l'acqua qua, finisce il cibo, gli ebrei che erano qua alzano la bandiera bianca e dicono basta.
But it is Josephus's tale of what the Romans found when they entered the compound that captured the world's imagination.
expecting further resistance, the Romans armed themselves at dawn, seeing no enemy but dreadful solitude at every side, fire within and silence.
All 960 men, women, and children committed suicide, according to Josephus, preferring death to surrender.
And it's a lesson for all of us to stand up to what is right and to be at the top of the mountain defending our convictions.
Ils ont vraiment été envahis, persécutés, donc ça fait quelque chose.
And I think this is one of your country's symbol. Never give up.
Several archaeological expeditions found evidence of Jewish life and of the Roman siege, but nothing to support Josephus's dramatic tale. But that did not prevent UNESCO from designating the isolated rock as a World Heritage Site, declaring it a symbol of the ancient Jewish kingdom of Israel, of its violent destruction, and of the subsequent diaspora. The Lovell family from New York, like many others in the Jewish diaspora, chose to hold their daughter's bat mitzvah, her coming-of-age ceremony, not in the customary synagogue, but on Masada. They posted the event on YouTube. For them, coming here is a symbolic return after a long exile.
We say at the Seder, on Passover, and on Yom Kippur, next year in Jerusalem. We're always saying that next year in Jerusalem for thousands of years. And now you have come to Jerusalem. You are in Israel.
In her bat mitzvah, 13-year-old Louisa sang Jerusalem of Gold, a popular Israeli song depicting Jerusalem as an empty city waiting for its exiled children to return. So if exile is ultimately an idea that cannot be supported by evidence, how and when was it born? To begin uncovering its roots, we need to explore yet one more rebellion that erupted 62 years after the destruction of Jerusalem. To the world, Masada is the symbolic end of Jewish life in Israel. In reality, the Jewish population not only survived and flourished, it even produced a second rebellion 60 years later. It was this rebellion, some claim, that is the origin of exile.
In Jerusalem, we saw the attempt of the Jews to try and revolt against the Roman, regaining their freedom and so on, not only once. The first huge revolt was the one that ended with the destruction of the city and the temple, and then 60 years later, another revolt started against the Roman.
The new rebellion that erupted against the Romans was limited mainly to the region of Judea. It was a guerrilla war, made possible in part by the desert and the caves that dot the area. The rebellion was led by a mysterious messianic leader named Bar Kokhba or Bar Kusba.
על מרד בר כוכבא אנחנו יודעים מעט מאוד. אנחנו אפילו לא בטוחים בשם של האיש שעל שמו נקרא המרד. אנחנו קוראים לו בר כוכבא, בן הכוכב. שמו האמיתי היה כנראה בר כוסבא. בר כוכבא קראו לו אלה שראו בו משיח. לעומת זאת, אלה שהתנגדו לו, קראו לו בר כוזיבה. בעברית, מי שהכזיב.
Where does the population supply come from for the second revolt? If we lost so many of the population to the first revolt?
Well, first of all, 2 generations passed, 60 years and more. That gave enough time to regain more people, and I would say that it was much more of a rural population revolt than the urban one of Jerusalem and the cities around. Demographically speaking, it's by far the end of everything over here. So what we'll do now is leaving the cultivated green area towards the desert, reaching the area where the people escaped to.
Israeli archaeologists were looking for historical roots, legitimacy, and a link to events that happened 1,800 years earlier. They were hoping to find archaeological evidence of the existence of Bar Kokhba to create such a link. In 1961, an archaeological expedition led by Professor Yigael Yadin set out on these desert roads to look for the remains of Bar Kokhba's fighters, which he saw as the last signs of independent Jewish life in the country.
אני הייתי סטודנט לתואר שני בתלמידו המובהק של ידין. והיה רק טבעי שכשהוא קיבל על עצמו את החפירה במערה הזאת ובנחל חבר, אז אני יצאתי איתו כעוזרו הראשי.
Yigael Yadin, who led the excavation, was no ordinary archaeologist. He was famous in Israel for serving as the army's chief of staff during the country's crucial War of Independence in 1948.
ידין הפך או נהפך בזכות כל מה שקרה מאז מלחמת השחרור בעצם לסמל של הארכיאולוגיה הלאומית.
Today's program is a conversation with Yigael Yadin, professor of archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem.
Helped by the army and the government, Yadin's was no ordinary expedition, but an attempt to find the archaeological evidence that would confirm the legitimacy of the Israeli state.
You see, this search for the Bar Kokhba documents, which you referred to, Mr. Agronsi, just now, was one of the most fascinating, I would say, expedition I had the privilege to take part.
Yadin, who was a great archaeologist, was very much involved, even emotionally, with the finds here, as was all of this generation of the big archaeologists. At the time, that was just a continuation of establishing the state and the search for roots and coming back to the country. And epos like the one of Bar Kokhba or Masada were very, very strong. So here we are, just above this huge canyon of Nachal Hever, running through the Dead Sea, and it has huge sheer cliffs going all the way down. And just to have some scale, if you look over there, you see the opening of the cave where those refugees found the shelter, and the distance from the top of the cliff to the cave is 350 feet.
And the caves are right in the middle of the canyon, sometimes 300 feet from the top and 900 feet from the bottom in a steep slope.
The people who found the shelter there could not leave the place. The Roman made sure that nobody would be able to escape.
היה צריך לרדת קודם באיזה שביל צר שאתה הולך כל הזמן ומסתכל ורואה את התהום מתחתיך. אז להגיע לאיזה מין טרסה מתחת למערה ולטפס על סולם חבלים אל הפתח. אחרי זה לזחול דרך איזה פתח צר, ואז להיכנס למערה חשוכה לגמרי, באורך של 250 מטר, שהיא כולה מלאה עטלפים.
And then only we came into the cave where we saw for the first time the first grim sight of the last moment of this desperate war, a heroic war of Bar Kokhba against the Romans.
The findings were indeed sensational. Rich evidence of daily life of refugees who hid in the caves, skeletons, personal documents, and even letters signed by Bar Kokhba himself. Yadin believed that he had found what he was looking for, the archaeological evidence of the last moments of the Jewish nation.
This was really, I would say, the last phase of the struggle against the Romans there.
And that was the last time, really, that the Jews, since in Jewish history, that there was a revolt that attempted to reconstitute the state of Israel.
This is the last revolt we call the second revolt, and actually 1800 years have passed since again the Jewish state was established here.
Yadin articulated the official Israeli narrative. Exile, indeed, began with the final loss of Jewish independence. "22 years after his discoveries, Israel's Prime Minister Menachem Begin flew with a group of politicians and dignitaries to the canyon. The skeletal remains unearthed by Yadin were given a full military state funeral.
אבותינו גיבורי התהילה, בשורה לנו, לכם, שבנו אל מאין באנו. עם ישראל חי ויחיה במולדתו בארץ ישראל לדורי דורות.
Both rebellions were used at different times to mark the beginning of exile. Yet none of these claims are supported by archaeological evidence. So when and how was the idea of exile born? For answers, we need to go back to Sepphoris, in the decades after the failure of Bar Kokhba's rebellion. Rome destroyed Jerusalem as a punishment for the first rebellion. As a punishment for the second rebellion, it forbade Jews to resettle in the city and its surroundings.
מרד בר כוכבא הוא קו שבר דמוגרפי, מפני שהוא גורם קודם כל לכך שהאזור שמסביב לירושלים נאסר במגורי יהודים, וגורם גם לכך שאוכלוסייה רבה עוברת מיהודה, מן החלק הדרומי, לחלק הצפוני, לגליל, ומתיישבת שמה.
The influx of refugees after the two rebellions must have brought with it the hard personal lessons learned from the failures of religious militancy.
אני חושב שמה שקרה בגליל זה העובדה שהחברה היהודית הבינה שהיא חלק מהמערך הגדול, ואם היא לא תהיה חלק מזה, יש לה הרבה מה להפסיד. ועל כן, עם התפיסה הזאת הם כמובן הלכו ופיתחו את האזור. באמת שאני לא מכיר בנייה של כנסיות בארץ, חוץ
Sepphoris not only grew and expanded, its rabbis tried to fill the huge gap created by the destruction of the temple, the center of Jewish worship and religious rituals. The rabbis' efforts cannot be archaeologically supported, but found in the religious rituals that emerged after the destruction. A family sits down to celebrate the Seder, the traditional Passover meal. Before the destruction of the temple, Jews were required to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem to offer sacrifices in the temple.
זה לא היה אפשר לקיים אחרי שבית המקדש נחרב, והיה צורך למצוא תחליף. התחליף שיצרה היהדות של חז"ל היא ליל הסדר. מה עושים בליל הסדר? מספרים סיפור. ויוצרים טקסט. לטקסט קוראים הגדה של פסח.
ההגדה של פסח נחתמת, נערכת, לאחר חורבן בית המקדש. ומציינת את הרציפות. בעצם מה קורה בהגדה של פסח? היא לא מדגישה את החורבן. היא מדגישה את הרציפות בין ההווה שאחרי חורבן בית המקדש ובין מעמד הר סיני.
The message is, Jewish tradition existed long before the temple, and it can survive its loss. New Jewish rituals were constructed in places like Sepphoris. They could be performed at home or in a synagogue, and were no longer tied to Jerusalem. But this emerging Jewish tradition was being challenged by another group of people. They too were sitting around the table on Passover Eve. Today they would be called Christians. Back then, they considered themselves Jews who followed Jesus. They too were trying to reconstruct their theology after the destruction of the temple. Their Haggadah was not about the Exodus. They retold the life of Jesus.
גם הם מספרים סיפור שקרה בפסח. גם הם מספרים סיפור על הצלה, על גאולה. המחלוקת בין שני הסיפורים היא איפה זה התרחש ואיזה גאולה הייתה. היהודים מספרים את סיפור יציאתם ממצרים כסיפור של מעבר מעבדות לחירות, מאפלה לאורה, כמו שנאמר בהגדה של פסח, והנוצרים מספרים את סיפור הצליבה, שגם הוא מעבר מאפלה, הצליבה, לאורה, התחייה שלו אחרי 3 ימים.
This argument revolves not only around the concept of redemption, but the meaning of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. The new Christians saw this as the wrath of God. Judaism, in contrast, chose to emphasize continuity over the destruction.
אחרי מרד בר כוכבא, מופיע לראשונה הרעיון גם של הגירוש מן הארץ, הגירוש מיהודה, כן? אבל הוא מופיע כניסיון להסביר מה קרה ליהודים. למה הם נענשו בשני אסונות גדולים שמתרחשים אחרי הצליבה.
Now, in these circles, the defeat of the revolt and the destruction of the temple begins to be seen as a divine sign that God has pronounced a judgment against Israel.
כאילו החורבן הוא נקודה ארכימדית שבה מתפצלות 2 דרכים. הנצרות יוצאת מירושלים החרבה לדרכה החדשה, דרך הפצתה והצלחתה, עד שבסופו של דבר היא תהפוך להיות הדת של האימפריה כולה, והיהדות, היהודים יוצאים לגלות הארוכה שלא תיגמר לעולם.
With the expansion of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire, how did this theological interpretation of exile impact the Jewish communities in the diaspora?
We are now in one of the Jewish catacombs of Rome. We have entered the catacomb. We're about 30 feet below the surface of the earth. And catacombs are underground burial places, so this is where the Jewish community buried its dead.
The catacombs are the only surviving remnant of the Jewish community in ancient Rome, a community that arrived long before the destruction of Jerusalem.
The Roman Jewish community began as an immigrant community. We don't know exactly when they came. There was a Jewish community here at least in the 1st century BCE, but it is possible that they came even earlier. The Jewish community, of course, needed a place to bury. And they had to think about this carefully because they were used to burying their dead as opposed to cremation, which is something that the Romans practiced at the time. The catacombs in that sense also tell us much about what Jewish life in the diaspora was like. The people that constructed these catacombs and used them continuously for hundreds of years were people that were really at home here. This was their home. This was the place where most of them were born.
A huge majority of Jews lived in the diaspora already. The number of Jews who lived in Judea and Galilee is really a minority of the total population of Judaism in the Roman world. We know, for instance, that in the city of Alexandria, where we have some reasonable demographic information, that there may have been as many as 1 million, that may be an exaggeration, but there may have been 1 million Jews living in Alexandria and Egypt. Now that's a huge number and way more than the number of Jews who lived in Judea and Galilee. They had carved out for themselves in places like Alexandria, Asia Minor, the major cities of what is now the western coast of Turkey, Rome and Italy, North Africa, then further to the east in Babylon and Syria. They had carved out an existence for themselves for centuries.
The funerary inscriptions are very interesting. They're a prime source of information for us to learn more about the Jewish community in ancient Rome. And the interesting thing about these inscriptions is not just the fact that they are in Greek and Latin, in any Greek or Latin, but that they were written in precisely the Greek and Latin that was spoken in Rome at the time. So linguistically, the Jews are completely integrated into the society that they lived in.
The Jewish community in Rome was part of a diaspora that historians now trace to the destruction of the ancient Israeli kingdom almost a millennium before the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans.
Traditionally, normally, the diaspora is seen as something of an anomaly, as sort of a temporary situation that then needs to be resolved by the whole Jewish community going back to the land of Israel. Well, nothing in the catacombs here suggests that these were people ready to go back. They were building up a new life. And the artwork and the inscriptions in the catacombs, as we have them, testify to that. They did find a good life here, and they were here to stay.
If Rome's Jews were once the center of a large Jewish community in the Roman Empire, today it is but a small congregation in a far larger Jewish diaspora. a diaspora that has spread for centuries all over the world. We will never know how each community came to be or where it is originally from. But like the Jewish community in Rome, they share the same rituals and the same sense of exile. Once a year, Jews all over the world lament, fast, and mourn the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple.
אתה צריך להיות כאן בערב תשעה באב, כשאנחנו זוכרים את החורבן. תראה כאן את בית הכנסת צפוף, ואין אורות, כולם עם נר של שעווה. שאומרים את הקינות. השגריר ישראל פעם אמר על זה, כאילו הגיע הפקס על חורבן ירושלים דווקא לפני 5 דקות. ממש מרגישים את האבל של ירושלים, כאילו זה דבר שקרה לפני 5 דקות.
הגלות היהודית בוודאי לא נולדה בעקבות חורבן הבית השני. הגלות היהודית הייתה קיימת מאז ומעולם. כבר במקרא יש... המקרא הוא תוצר של גלות. המשפט הראשון שאלוהים אומר לאברהם זה לך לך מארצך, ממולדתך, מבית אביך, אל הארץ אשר אראך. אברהם הוא הראשון שיוצא לגלות. עם ישראל הופך לעם. איפה? במצרים. הם מגיעים משם כ-70 נפש, 70 בני משפחת יעקב, ויוצאים משם כעם. זאת אומרת, הגלות מלווה את החוויה היהודית מראשיתה.
The Torah and Jewish laws were handed down in the desert, not in the Holy Land. That land, according to the Bible, had to be conquered in a cruel and violent campaign. According to scholars like Israel Yuval, no other ethnic or religious group has a similar founding myth that describes the birth of a people in exile and its promised homeland as the result of conquest.
הדבר המדהים הוא שהמקרא מאמץ את זה. המקרא רוצה את זה אפילו. המקרא רוצה לתאר עם שהארץ שלו על תנאי. אם תתנהג כמו שתקיים את הברית עם האלוהים, תשב לבטח במולדתך. לא תקיים את הברית, אתה תופץ בכל העולם.
אחינו בית ישראל שמעו, היום 1942 שנים שנחרב בית קודשנו ותפארתנו, נפלה
Jews see their homeland as a conditional gift of God. So when Christians interpreted exile as God's punishment, the Jews were able to accept this explanation.
הנוצרים אומרים, מפני חטאיכם גליתם מארצכם, והיהודים מודים ואומרים נכון, והמחלוקת היא רק איזה חטא. הנוצרים אומרים חטא הצליבה, היהודים אומרים חטאים אחרים, חטא שנאת חינם שהיה בינינו. שתי הדתות הגדולות מסכימות על העיקרון, מסכימות על הפרשנות שהגלות היא מעשה, לא מעשה ידי אדם, אלא מעשה ידי אלוהים, ובני אדם הם אלה שהמיתו על עצמם את העונש הכבד הזה.
This complex Jewish-Christian theology assumed a far more ominous dimension after the Christianization of Europe.
La percezione dell'esilio è stato sicuramente l'affermazione del cristianesimo che ha creato un confronto fra una minoranza monoteista e una maggioranza monoteista che modifica completamente lo scenario anche culturale d'Europa. Gli ebrei avevano bisogno quindi, come dicevo, di condotte, di permessi, non erano equiparati agli altri, ai cristiani.
The Wandering Jew, an early 20th century silent film depicting a centuries-old myth of Jews condemned to roam the earth forever. An anti-Semitic image of Jews in perpetual exile, the eternal foreigners. The acceptance of exile as an explanation for Jewish suffering led to the growing belief in the messianic dream of returning to the Holy Land.
באופן פרדוקסלי, היהודים שותפים לראיית ההיסטוריה שהיא, להערכתי, נולדה בתוך השדה הנוצרי, בכך שגם הם שואפים אל הרסטורציה שלהם. כלומר, אם אנחנו גלינו מארצנו, זה מעשה לא נורמלי, שהעם יוצא מארצו. אז יש גם סיבה לקוות שנשוב אליה.
The reality of exile, which has become associated with suffering, even with genocide, helped to transform the messianic dream of return into a political project. In November 1947, after the United Nations voted to establish a Jewish state, some Roman Jews chose to celebrate the event in front of Titus Gate, an enduring symbol of the destruction of Jerusalem and the beginning of exile. Centuries of anti-Semitism reawakened a Jewish national dream that was defeated in Jerusalem in 70 AD, a dream first articulated by Josephus. But to understand what happened when the dream met reality, we have to go back to the Galilee and to Sepphoris. Suleiman Abu Ali is returning to his village. He was 14 years old when he left it 63 years ago. Suleiman is accompanied by a young relative whose family was born in the village.
كل يوم الصبح والمغرب بتذكرني في أشياء مهمة جدا. الصبح بكير كنت تسمع الناس اللي رايحة على الإحراث، وقت الإحراث بينادوا كل واحد على مرته من الطابون هاتنا ولين الرغيف خبز الخبزات بدنا نروح على الحرات وروح على الحرات. كل هاي الاشياء الصبح والمغرب. كل هاي المغرب والصبح تذكرني في هاي الاشياء كل يوم، كل يوم الصبح والمغرب.
Suleiman's village, Safuri, does not exist anymore. It was destroyed in the War of 1948. Safuri, the Palestinian village, was built on the ruins of ancient Jewish Sepphoris. This picture was taken by the archaeological team that came here in the summer of 1931, 3 years before Suleiman's birth. Leroy Waterman, a professor from the University of Michigan, led the first archaeological expedition to unearth the ancient Jewish city of Sepphoris. Like all archaeologists who came before him, Leroy was a devout Christian. He felt he was a traveler in a biblical landscape. For him, Safuri was barely visible. The Christian-Jewish town that Leroy Waterman began to unearth had evolved since the 7th century into a bustling, primarily Muslim village with a population of more than 5,000 people. Slowly, ancient Sepphoris was coming to life, and soon it was going to devour Safuri. The village was occupied on July 16, 1948, as part of the last phase of what Israel calls its War of Independence. The Palestinian villagers fled. Their village was destroyed, and they were barred from returning.
شايف هيا؟ شايف يا زياد؟ يا دارنا يا دارنا. شايف الحديد كيف حديد دارنا؟ هاي دار كانت.
Safuri villagers settled in a nearby town and in neighboring countries. The village's lands were divided between an Israeli settlement and an archaeological park.
حجر يابس وهناك هذول اوضتين حجر ناري يقولوا لها دف ومسمار، وهاي بطون. هاي يا عمي ما حتى هاي هذيك الأوضة كانت معمول لها أبواب وكل شيء، وهاي بعدها مش معمول لها أبواب. والله بعدها ما معمول لها أبواب. من هون كان في قصة قدامها، يعني هون كانت في ساحة بتجنن وفي عريشة دالي، وهي هالدالي كأنها ميتي.
Safuri was a densely populated village, so Leroy Waterman was limited in his digging. The destruction allowed Zev Weiss many years later to unearth the full glory of ancient Sepphoris. In the national park, a visitor won't find out much about its 1,300 years of Muslim history. The park's museum, formerly one of Safuri's schools, highlights primarily the Jewish history of the place.
ספוריה בתקופה הערבית המוסלמית הייתה אחד המקומות החשובים באזור, או אפילו בארץ, ובתקופות מסוימות הייתה מרכז של האזור, מרכז אדמיניסטרטיבי. ההרס של הכפר ב-1948 הוא כמובן הרס של כפר גדול ומשגשג, בעצם זריקת אנשים מהבית שלהם, אבל מעבר לזה יש בו גם אובדן היסטורי עצום, אובדן של רצף, של המשכיות, של פלורליזם היסטורי, של רב-גוניות של התמונה ההיסטורית וההסתכלות ההיסטורית, ובעצם ניסיון, מאז יש ניסיון להנצחה של הנרטיב האחד, החד-גוני והעלמת האחרים.
This village cemetery escaped destruction only after a long legal struggle. It has a historical importance to Muslims as the resting place of some of the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad.
בכפר הזה גדל אל-בידאווי, אחד מששת הפרשנים החשובים ביותר של הקוראן. אני מרגיש כלפי כל ניסיון למחוק, למזער, להסתיר, להדיר את האחר, זה עושה לי צביטה בלב. זה עושה לי צביטה בלב. אני חושב מחויבות כהיסטוריון להראות לאנשים את הרב-גוניות. הרי היסטוריה נועדה כדי ללמד אנשים ללמוד איך לחיות. ומרבדים, רב-גוניות ותמונה פנורמית של ההיסטוריה מלמדת את האנשים לסובלנות, איך לחיות ואיך לקבל את האחר ולחיות אותו בשלום.
אני רוצה לספר לכם סיפור עליי, כילדה שגדלה כאן בציפורי לפני 40 שנה, היום אני בת 44.
Eti Koryat Ahon was born in the Jewish settlement established on the lands of Safuri. Today she is a guide in the national park.
תנסו לדמיין ממש ילדות של בר, יחפת רגליים, מצטרפת הרבה מאוד לאבא שלה, שעוסק בעיקר בשמירה על הסודות של ציפורי. הוא שומר על הסודות של ציפורי כי הרבה קודם, בשנות ה-50, כשהייתה עלייה גדולה לארץ, על ידי עולים חדשים שבאו מאירופה בעיקר, ובציפורי בפרט מרומניה, הם עסקו בנטיעה של עצים, כל היערות קקל שאתם רואים היום בציפורי. ובלילה, הערבים, השכנים ליישובים היהודיים, הם פשוט היו מגיעים לאותן חלקות של נטיעה, כשהעצים היו כבר נטועים, ופשוט מושכים אותם.
To erase the memory of the village, the Jewish National Fund covered the original site with this forest. Young refugees like Suleiman used to sneak in at night and uproot the saplings that were planted on the ruins of their homes. The forest grew over the village, but its memory survives.
הלכתי מרצוני, رحت بإرادتي يعني بعدين صرت أروح بإرادتي عشان أعرف لأنه خلقت في بيت اللي كله لجوء يعني سيدي وستي وسيدي وستي من جهة أمي وأبوي كليات من ما بدينا نكبر ونسمع أنت من صفوري أنت مش بالضبط من الناصري يعني أنت خلقان بالناصري بس أنت من صفوري فمين هاي صفوري شو هاي صفوري صار في عندي حاجة إنه أعرف أكثر.
In 1985, Eddie participated in the first expedition of the Hebrew University to excavate Sepphoris. It is here, as an archaeologist, that she found her family's name, Aharon, in the mosaic.
יכול להיות שזו משפחה שהייתה כאן אהרון, ויכול להיות שזו כתובת אהרון שרוצה לתאר את הציור של אהרון, אהרון הכהן. אבל עבורי זו הייתה סגירת מעגל מאוד חשובה, לדעת שהסבא והסבתא שלי ואבא שלי גרו כאן בציפורי, והם לא ידעו בחייהם שבבטן האדמה כבר 1500 שנה נמצאת הכתובת אהרון.
There are many missing pieces in the thousands of years of Sepphoris' and Sepphoris' history. The city was destroyed and resettled several times. Yet in 1948, the city was for the first time permanently erased. During its long history, Jews left and resettled Sepphoris several times. Yet the only record of an actual exile is that of Suleiman and the 5,000 villagers who once lived here. Is it possible that some of these refugees are distant descendants of the Jewish population of Sepphoris who were never exiled?
أنا ما فهمتهاش كيف فهمتها كيف أنا بفهمها اليوم بالمرة. أنا حتى أنا كنت أفكر شخصياً كيف تفكيري كان وأنا صغير. كنت أفكر كل الدنيا إسلام وفي كل بلد في دير. ما كنتش أفهم إنه في مسيحية وفي يهود في كل العالم هي إسلام. هيك كنت يعني هذا كان تفكيري صحيح.
لأنه ما كانش عندنا
مسيحية. ما كنتش لا كان مسيحية ولا حتى كان عندنا دير. أنا فكرت الدير هو إسلام وأنا ما كنتش أفهم شو إسلام ومسيحية ويهود والإسلام كلها نفس الشيء. هيك كنت أفكر.
אבא שלי הוא בעצם עסק במחקר מתוך האנשים שהוא פגש אותם. הוא כותב כאן שאת הידע ההיסטורי רכשתי גם משלוש חמולות של ערבים מוסלמים, תושבי ציפורי הקדומה שהם היו יהודים והתאסלמו. כלומר, אין דבר יפה אם תרצה יותר לסיים ככה, שבעצם השלטון בא והדת באה, אבל האנשים הם אותם אנשים.
The evidence of this complex, multi-ethnic history of the region can be found everywhere in the Galilee. In a town only a few miles from Sepphoris, a local journalist takes visitors to an ancient grave of a Jewish rabbi who's been revered for over a millennium by the mostly Muslim population.
שהתושבים הפלסטינים, תושבי הערבים של הגליל, הם היו אלה שבמשך מאות שנים שימרו מסורות של הקיום היהודי בגליל. כשבאים במאה ה-16 יהודים לצפת, והם מחפשים את קברי התנאים, מי שמשמר להם ומספר להם על מקומות הקברים האלה, הם ערבים. זאת אומרת שאנשי צפורי גם שמרו את המסורת היהודית.
local women still hang those rags, seeking a blessing from the rabbi.
למשל, אני רוצה שהבן שלי אז, שיהיה מורה בית ספר, או שהוא ילמד בית ספר. אלוהים, צדיק, תעזור לי. אז אנחנו שמים את זה, אחד חדש, וחוזרים הביתה פסיכולוגית, שבאמת הצדיק הזה הוא יעזור לנו. האמת שאמרו צדיק, אני לא, צדיק. צדיק, אתה עובר ליד צדיק, אתה עובר ליד צדיק. האמת שלא שאלתי אם זה יהודי או מוסלמי. צדיק זה צדיק לכולם.
For centuries, the peasants of Sefuri preserved this grave believed by some to be that of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi, Sepphoris's most important scholar. The rabbi helped transform Sepphoris into one of the most important spiritual centers of Judaism after the fall of Jerusalem.
ואותם אנשים, הוא אומר, הם בעצם היו יהודים שהתאסלמו לפני 1,300 שנה, ואלה המשפחות שהוא מדבר איתם, ומהם הוא דולה את הסיפורים. הגעתי למשפחות האלה, נפגשתי איתם, דיברתי איתם. התאגדנו כ10 אנשים מציפורי, ורצינו בהנחיה של 2 אנשים שהיו אמורים להנחות אותנו, את המפגש של אנשי ציפורי עם אנשי ספוריה לשעבר. זה לא צלח, לא הצליח.
The job of historians isn't to crush memory. It's not to destroy it. It's actually to hold it up and pull it apart without necessarily standing in the way of those people who want to put it back together afterwards. I think that it's the job of historians to remind people what's at stake in their shared memories. That is, what the effects of those shared memories are and what use they can be put to. But I think that there's actually some, moral urgency and seriously in what historians do, in taking these things and analyzing them and showing how far they can be from, ascertainable historical realities of the past. That there's, go on believing your myths, but at least understand what you're doing by doing that.
What is being unearthed in the ruins of Sepphoris and Sefuri is a message of hope and a warning. The promise of hope from a town that survived for hundreds of years because of its capacity to embrace many cultures and traditions. And a warning written in the destruction brought about by blind faith in a single narrative of history at the expense of others.